She was 5 minutes from walking the stage, as valedictorian, until the principal yanked her diploma and whispered, "We don't reward that kind of activism here." Cameras rolled, her parents screamed, and as security dragged her out, someone leaked the real reason behind the sabotage, and it wasn't her grades. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was the kind of day poets write about. Cloudless sky, soft breeze, the subtle perfume of roses drifting through the air. The backyard of 412 Oakland Glen Drive had been transformed into a sanctuary of joy. Rows of white chairs curved toward a modest but elegant gazebo draped in ivory silk and wild flowers. Soft jazz hummed through the air, mingling with the laughter of guests who had arrived in brightly colored attire, glowing with love and anticipation. At the center of it all stood Amira Caldwell, her mocha skin radiant beneath the afternoon sun. A respected OB/GYN with a heart as vast as her intellect, she wore a modern lace gown that clung to her frame with the kind of grace only earned through confidence and purpose. She adjusted her pearl earrings in a mirror, nerves and joy wrestling for space in her chest. This wasn't just her wedding day, it was a declaration of survival, love, and dignity. Her fiancé, Jonas Mercer, was already outside, shaking hands, embracing cousins, and making the rounds with the kind of ease only a seasoned politician could summon. But this wasn't a campaign event. No speeches, no cameras, just family, friends, and the sacred act of committing to forever. Jonas, 38, was the youngest sitting governor in Maryland's history. Black, bold, and beloved. He'd grown up in the tough blocks of East Baltimore, raised by a widowed mother who worked 2 jobs and still managed to march for civil rights on weekends. His journey from the housing projects to Harvard Law to the governor's mansion was the stuff of American legend, yet he never forgot who he was or where he came from. Every decision he made was measured against a single question: would my mother be proud of this? This wedding, hosted in the lush backyard of their West Ridge home, was intentional. They could have rented a ballroom, but Jonas insisted, if we're going to build roots, let's do it in the soil we paid for. West Ridge was an affluent suburb just outside Annapolis, Maryland, a place known for its quiet charm, manicured lawns, and unspoken lines. But not everyone welcomed the celebration. Carolyn Whitmore, age 62, watched from behind her lace curtains. Her home sat just one property over, perfectly positioned to observe every unfolding detail. Her face, though still pleasant in its features, had stiffened into a frown of suspicion. She sipped her decaf coffee like it was poison, her eyes narrowing as another car with tinted windows pulled into the cul-de-sac. She didn't recognize most of the guests, so many of them, she thought, and so loud. Her fingers tapped against the phone screen she held in her lap, not yet dialing, but lingering. Over the past few years, Carolyn had exchanged a few pleasantries with Amira, mostly about landscaping or neighborhood watch meetings. They'd never been close. She didn't dislike Amira. She just didn't understand her. Carolyn had grown up in West Ridge. To her, it had always been a place of tradition, order, familiarity, not block parties, and dancing and food trucks parked outside someone's home. She couldn't place why she felt so unsettled. The decorations were tasteful. The guests were well-dressed. Yet her stomach churned. She had long convinced herself that she didn't see color. But the truth was, she noticed it every time. Every time a new black family moved into West Ridge. Every time she passed by the local high school and noticed the changing demographics. Every time she heard bass in the distance. As the music swelled and the laughter grew, her unease calcified into suspicion. Her eyes fell on a group of groomsmen, adjusting their suits near a parked SUV. From her vantage point, the tuxedos looked like tactical gear. The SUV, black with government plates, set her heart racing. "I'm probably being dramatic," she whispered aloud. But Carolyn had always believed it was better to be safe than sorry. Her hand hovered over her phone once more. Then she made the call. First to the local police department. The operator transferred her to Homeland Security's tip line, where she spoke in calm, clipped tones. "There's something strange happening next door. Large gathering. Lots of noise. I'm worried it may be gang-related, or some kind of extremist event. I saw what might be weapons or military-style uniforms." She never used the words black or wedding, but her description was laced with the kind of racially coded language federal agencies had been trained to flag. The call was recorded, documented, and transferred again, this time to a regional FBI joint task force monitoring domestic threats. The protocol was simple: investigate first, De-escalate later. Back at the wedding, Jonas stood under the gazebo, holding a delicate crystal flute filled with sparkling cider. He raised it high, his baritone voice commanding but warm. To love, he said. To family. To ancestors we carry within us. The guests erupted into cheers, clinking glasses, lifting children onto shoulders. Amira stepped forward, her smile so wide it made an elderly woman in the front row weep. I know it's not traditional to toast before the vows, Jonas continued, chuckling. But today isn't about tradition, it's about truth. Just as he lifted the glass to his lips, the sky erupted with thunder. It wasn't a storm, it was the low mechanical hum of helicopter blades slicing the air above them. Guests instinctively looked up. Confused murmurs rose. Two military-style choppers descended in a sweeping arc, sending tablecloths and flower petals into the air. Seconds later, unmarked black SUVs screeched onto the cul-de-sac, tires screeching against the pavement. Armed agents in tactical vests poured out, rifles drawn, not pointed, but visible. Guests froze. Some ducked. A few screamed. Jonas instinctively stepped in front of Amira, his hand shielding her. He looked around, heart pounding, scanning for a threat that didn't exist, at least not from his side. The lead agent shouted commands. Hands visible. No sudden moves. This is a federal investigation. An older uncle in a beige linen suit was wrestled to the ground after trying to shield a child. One of Jonas's aides, who had also served in his security detail, was shoved back against a speaker system. Jonas shouted, "This is a private residence. I'm Governor Jonas Mercer, and this is my home." The words should have stopped everything, but they didn't. Not at first. From her window, Carolyn's hand shook. Coffee mug forgotten on the windowsill. Her jaw dropped. Her face drained of color. She hadn't known. She hadn't asked. She had assumed. And now the neighborhood she had fought so hard to keep safe was filled with chaos because of her. One of the agents stepped back, pulled out a tablet, tapped rapidly, then stared at Jonas's face. "Sir," the agent murmured to his earpiece. "We've got a serious issue. The subject is confirmed. He's the sitting governor of Maryland." On the ground, Jonas's hand was still raised, eyes burning with a mix of calm fury and heartbreak. Amira's dress had been torn at the sleeve in the confusion. A child was crying, plates shattered, and somewhere in the distance a guest live-streamed everything to Instagram. And just as the guests began to demand answers, a third vehicle arrived. But this one didn't belong to any federal agency. It bore state plates, and a passenger who would make the headlines explode. As Jonas raises his glass to toast, helicopters thunder overhead, and armed agents storm the backyard. The first ring had barely echoed when the voice on the other end of the Homeland Security tip line answered with sterile professionalism. "Homeland Security, please state your concern." Carolyn Whitmore cleared her throat, adjusting the throw blanket across her lap, her voice steady but carefully uncertain, an act rehearsed in her head, for minutes before she even made the call. "Hi. I don't know if this is the right place, but something's going on next door. It's just not right." The agent on the line pressed record. "What's happening?" Carolyn's eyes darted to the window. From her vantage point behind the blinds, she could see guests arriving in waves. Laughter floated through the summer air, music pulsed in rhythm, with the rising joy, and yet, her gaze turned it all into something sinister. There's a large gathering, unusual activity. Loud shouting. There might be weapons, military-style dress, SUVs. The agent's voice sharpened. "Weapons? Well, I can't say for sure. But the men outside are dressed in some kind of tactical gear," she added, her voice trembling, weaponizing her own uncertainty. And the music foreign-sounding. Not English. Chanting. Almost. The agent typed rapidly, each keystroke an echo of Carolyn's prejudice wrapped in bureaucratic neutrality. "Any signs of threats? Hostile behavior?" Carolyn lowered her voice conspiratorially. "There's a lot of movement. People going in and out of vehicles. It's hard to say, but it seems organized. Like a cell." She let the silence linger just long enough for her last word to sink in. She knew what she was doing. She didn't need to say black. She didn't need to say wedding. Just plant the seed. Let the system do what it always had. The call was flagged as potential domestic threat. Suburban anomaly. Within 5 minutes it had been routed to the Baltimore-Washington Domestic Threat Task Force. That pipeline, designed after 9/11 to catch lone wolves and terror plots, had evolved over 2 decades into a web that more often than not snapped shut over the wrong people, especially when wrong meant non-white. At the Central Command Office in Bethesda, Special Agent Kyle Drenner was already 3 hours into his 12-hour shift. His office smelled of burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. The blinds were always drawn. His desk was cluttered with manila folders and old warrants. A plaque on the wall read, "Protect and Preempt." Kyle Drenner was the kind of man who trusted data more than people, instinct more than dialogue. 15 years in the Bureau had made him efficient, jaded, and quietly biased in ways he would never admit out loud. His past included 2 commendations, 1 divorce, and an unofficial warning for overreach in profiling tactics. He wore the warning like a badge. When the alert pinged on his screen, his eyes scanned the report. Large crowd, military attire, chanting, foreign elements, possible weapons, potential cell activity in West Ridge, Maryland. He raised an eyebrow. West Ridge was a rich suburb. Domestic threats didn't happen there. Not unless he clicked the attached video file, a 30-second clip from a neighbor's Ring camera, anonymously submitted. It showed groomsmen laughing, passing out fans to guests, adjusting their jackets. But Carolyn's framing, combined with the silence of the footage, created ambiguity. The polished tuxedos looked more rigid on mute. The SUVs could pass for something more ominous. And the lack of context gave space for imagination to fester. Drenner didn't hesitate. He stood, grabbed his tablet, and headed down the corridor toward Command Ops. "We're greenlighting an operation," he said flatly. "Unknown threat in West Ridge. Possible extremist event. Assemble Team Alpha and Bravo. Choppers on standby." No one questioned him. Not the junior agents, still eager to impress. Not the analysts who trusted procedure over conscience. The magic words, domestic cell, potential weapons, had been spoken. That was all it took. Back in West Ridge, Carolyn hadn't moved from the window. She clutched the cordless phone like a remote to her own drama series. She didn't feel guilt, only the faint thrill of power. She believed she had prevented something terrible. She told herself that again and again. A line from her past rang in her ears, something her late husband once said after they heard loud music at a neighbor's barbecue. If they don't belong, they need to be reminded where the line is. Carolyn had kept that philosophy tucked behind polite smiles and casserole invitations. Today she'd redrawn the line herself. As helicopters broke the horizon, she watched with a curious mixture of satisfaction and awe. The wind whipped through the backyard. Flower petals danced like confetti in the air. People were confused. Some were frightened, but Carolyn felt vindicated, until the scream cut through everything. "He's the governor. That's the governor." It came from a young man near the gazebo. His voice panicked, but clear enough to pierce the roar of engines. The agents stopped in their tracks for a moment, radios flaring to life with static. Carolyn froze. The coffee cup she had refilled hours ago slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. In the distance, one of the agents placed a hand to his earpiece. His face paled. "Command, we've identified the subject. He's Governor Jonas Mercer. Repeat, the individual is Governor Jonas Mercer. We've breached the residence of the sitting governor of Maryland." Carolyn's mouth went dry. The name hit her like a brick. Her heart, which had been steady, now raced uncontrollably. She'd voted for him. She hadn't made the connection. Never saw him on the lawn, only heard the noise, saw the guests. And in those moments, her assumption that dangerous activity must be happening had overridden every rational thought. She had turned him into a suspect in his own backyard. From the helicopter, a voice rang out through a megaphone. "Stand down. Repeat. Stand down. Secure perimeter. No detainments." The wedding guests erupted in angry disbelief. Children cried. Elderly guests were ushered to chairs, still trembling. Carolyn couldn't look away. A flashing red and blue lights painted her living room walls. She had become the architect of an incident that was already spinning out of control. She could feel it. A story being written in real time. One where she would not be remembered kindly. She pressed her face closer to the glass, praying for invisibility. Down below, Jonas stood at the center of the chaos. His glass shattered, his expression unreadable, caught between rage and resignation. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The cameras were already rolling. Phones captured everything. But the damage was done. And in the distance, in a mobile command van no one had seen pull up, Agent Drenner slammed his tablet shut, muttering under his breath, "We just raided the governor's wedding. The room fell silent. Then his phone vibrated. Unknown number. High clearance code. He picked up. Agent Drenner, this is Director Kaminsky. I need you to explain right now why the governor of Maryland was just held at gunpoint during a federal operation on U.S. soil. Drenner didn't have an answer. And in a quiet neighborhood that had always prided itself on control, an ugly truth had just been revealed. All it took was one biased voice to summon a federal response meant for war. Carolyn smiles at the flashing lights, until she hears a guest scream, "He's the governor." Handcuffs were not new to Jonas Mercer, not for himself, but for the countless black boys he'd once coached through debate tournaments in East Baltimore. The men he'd sat beside in courtroom benches during his early pro bono legal days, the families he'd embraced after wrongful arrests shattered their peace. But never had he imagined he'd feel the cold steel against his own wrists at his wedding. As two agents flanked him under the shredded ribbons of the gazebo, Jonas stood motionless. His gaze swept the crowd, family, friends, mentors, constituents, and Amira, all frozen in a moment too surreal to understand. His hands were behind his back, not struggling, just resting there, as if he were holding something sacred together inside himself. And in a way he was. Jonas Mercer had grown up knowing the rules of proximity and survival. Son of Reverend Elijah Mercer, a firebrand preacher who once led marches through West Baltimore. Jonas had been fed protest with his morning prayers and history books before cartoons. Their modest apartment sat across the street from a boarded-up grocery store, and yet inside their home there were always fresh books, loud love, and one unrelenting rule: never let them steal your mind. Jonas had lived by it, earned a scholarship to Yale, graduated top of his class, became the youngest clerk in Maryland's Court of Appeals, then the youngest senator in state history. When he ran for governor at 35, people laughed. Then they watched. Then they voted. Landslide. His inauguration drew tears across generational divides. To many, he wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol that America could maybe learn, could grow. But Jonas never drank the myth. His father's warning echoed constantly in his ears. Son, titles don't shield you from bullets, only character keeps you breathing. Now surrounded by federal agents, that wisdom burned inside his chest. Amira, still in her torn gown, tried to push through the line of officers. "He's the governor, this is insane." A younger agent held her back, visibly shaken. "Ma'am, this isn't coming from us. Orders came from higher. Higher than who?" Guests pulled out phones, capturing every angle. A chorus of voices demanded answers. Why is he in cuffs? What's he being charged with? This is the governor of Maryland. Do you even know who you're arresting? Jonas looked toward Amira, his eyes steady, his voice low but audible. "It's okay. I'm okay." But he wasn't okay. Not really. Because deep down, he wasn't even surprised. This moment had always been waiting for him. In politics, there were unspoken whispers, of course. From donors who asked if he could soften the urban talk. From aides who flinched when he used words like systemic. From white reporters who marveled that he was so articulate. Even on Capitol Hill, Jonas could feel the difference between tolerance and acceptance. He was in the room but never fully in the circle. That truth came crashing down now in front of 200 witnesses, many of whom had voted for him, cheered for him, called him their hope. Now they watched as he was treated like a threat in a tailored suit and wedding boutonniere, and the irony wasn't lost on him. They had put shackles on a man whose policies had reduced state incarceration rates by 17%, who had banned private prisons, who'd invested millions in bias training for local police departments, who'd personally sponsored legislation to hold officers accountable for racial profiling. And yet here he stood, handcuffed. No Miranda rights, no explanation, no de-escalation. One of the groomsmen, Marcus Tate, his longtime campaign manager and childhood friend, stepped forward with both hands raised. "He's not a threat. This is a private function. You have no cause." An officer shoved him back, saying, "Do not interfere." Another guest, an elderly woman with silver braids and a cane, sobbed openly. She had marched in Selma. She had watched Malcolm speak. Now she watched Jonas, her grandson's hero, humiliated on his wedding day. Cameras kept rolling. It was chaos with a quiet edge. People screamed, but the real noise was inside their chests. The question of why, and beneath that the bitter answer: because he was black and powerful, and that still made him dangerous to someone. Inside the federal command van, Agent Kyle Drenner watched the footage live with growing dread. Something was wrong. Protocol had been followed, but something wasn't lining up. A tech analyst leaned in. Sir, the facial recognition scan just confirmed his ID. We have a match. Drenner's jaw tightened. Confirmed what? Subject is Jonas Elijah Mercer, sitting governor of Maryland. He's who the agents cuffed. Silence fell over the mobile unit like a blanket soaked in kerosene. Drenner turned slowly toward the screen. As a junior agent adjusted the zoom, there was no mistaking it. Now, the face matched the political ads, the billboards, the campaign trail. But what no algorithm could scan was the way Jonas stood, not with arrogance, but with a practiced understanding of humiliation. He didn't flinch. He'd been here before, spiritually if not literally. A comms officer whispered, "Sir, this might go viral in seconds." Back in the backyard, Amira's mother collapsed into a chair, hands over her mouth. "This isn't happening," she whispered. "This can't be happening." And yet it was. A white neighbor 2 doors down finally emerged onto her porch, mouth ajar, holding a lemonade glass she suddenly felt ashamed of. She had lived near Jonas and Amira for years, never said more than hello, never offered a casserole. And now she watched as federal agents pointed rifles at men in tuxedos while a black bride begged for answers. A child began to cry. From behind the gazebo, a young girl whispered to her aunt, "Why are they hurting him?" The aunt had no answer. Because how do you explain to a child that in America, even when you follow every rule, your skin still marks you as suspicious? Then suddenly, one of the agents stepped back, touched his earpiece, and blinked rapidly. He turned to another agent, whispering something short. The second agent's eyes widened. "What?" he mouthed. The first leaned in again, repeating it, this time more urgently. "We made a huge mistake." And just like that, the script began to tear. The foundation of the operation cracked beneath the weight of its own flawed assumptions. Drenner's radio erupted with a call from command. "Abort. Abort. Secure and disengage. Do not escalate." It was too late. The world had already seen what it needed to see. But in the final seconds of chaos, as agents scrambled to coordinate their exit, one of them glanced at the woman standing on her porch, the one holding her lemonade, and nodded ever so slightly. She recognized him. Not from the neighborhood. Not from the news, but from her church. She blinked hard, suddenly unsure of who exactly had authorized this nightmare. Because someone knew who Jonas was before this all began. And that meant this wasn't just a mistake. It might have been a setup. An agent whispers into his radio, eyes widening. "We made a huge mistake." The air was still thick with disbelief. The handcuffs had barely come off when a sound more powerful than sirens began to echo. The collective buzz of notifications. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Within 20 minutes, videos of the wedding raid exploded online. One, taken from the center aisle, showed Jonas Mercer's hands being restrained under the arch where vows should have been spoken. Another, posted by his goddaughter, captured Amira crying out, "He's the governor," as agents pushed through the crowd. The clips were raw, unedited, emotional. The kind of footage algorithms, loved and consciences couldn't ignore. By the time the helicopters retreated, Black Governor Raided was trending in 3 states. Within an hour, it was global. Jonas hadn't said a word publicly yet, but the world had already started speaking for him. It started with a tweet from a civil rights attorney in Chicago. "Jonas Mercer is the sitting governor of Maryland, raided, humiliated, and cuffed at his own wedding by federal agents who didn't even recognize his face. Let that sink in. Black governor raided." Then came the screenshots. Then the outrage. Across social platforms, internet sleuths mobilized like soldiers on caffeine. They cross-referenced public photos of Jonas, confirmed that the backyard in question matched his publicly listed home address. An old magazine interview with Architectural Digest had showcased his backyard design. It was identical to the now iconic footage with fallen flower petals and overturned chairs. Within minutes, online threads exploded. This wasn't a mistake. This was racism in a 3-piece suit. If Jonas can be treated like this, what hope does any of us have? I'm shaking. My son idolizes him. What do I tell him now? By hour 2, the media floodgates opened. CNN broke into regular programming. MSNBC looped the footage with legal analysts trying and failing to justify the raid. Fox News hesitated, then aired a cautious headline. "Governor mistaken for threat at private event. FBI investigates." But the images needed no commentary. One especially viral photo captured by an iPhone from the second row showed Jonas standing barefoot on the grass, hands behind his back, tuxedo jacket stained with wine, while an agent stared at his ID in horror. In the background, Amira knelt beside a toppled floral arrangement, her face etched with devastation. It was the kind of photo that didn't just document history, it triggered it. Jonas's press secretary, who hadn't even attended the wedding, was suddenly fielding over 100 interview requests. State senators called emergency meetings, civil rights groups drafted formal letters within hours, legal watchdogs launched inquiries. But the most devastating voice came not from the legal community, but from the past. Amira's grandmother, 82-year-old Mildred Caldwell, had marched with Martin, had organized food drives during the Baltimore riots, had seen it all, but even she, wrapped in a powder blue shawl, with tear-streaked cheeks, could not comprehend what she'd just witnessed. CNN secured a live interview with her from the hospital, where she had been taken after collapsing from stress after the raid. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. I've watched my people hosed in the streets. I've watched dogs sicked on schoolchildren. But I never thought I'd watch a black governor cuffed like a criminal at his own wedding. Not in 2025. Not here. The anchor had no follow-up. The moment said everything. Meanwhile, inside the Caldwell-Mercer home, Jonas sat on the edge of their bed, still in his dress shirt, sleeves rolled up. His phone buzzed non-stop, texts from governors, senators, national figures offering outrage and condolences. Amira, seated on the floor beside him, had finally stopped crying, but she hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Her gown had dried along the hem, stained from the grass and tears. Jonas finally looked at her. Say something. She blinked slowly. I don't know what to say to you. He nodded, understanding even the words she hadn't said. I should have predicted this, he whispered. Somewhere in me, I knew the day would come when no amount of work, no suit, no title, would matter, that I'd still be that to them. Suspect? Amira said, her voice flat. He nodded again. You know what kills me the most? She asked. He waited. That our child, if we ever have one, will watch this video one day, and they'll know before they ever understand what a wedding is, that their father was cuffed on his. Jonas's chest tightened. He hadn't even thought that far ahead, but now the thought buried itself like a shard under his rib. Down the street, behind closed curtains, Carolyn Whitmore watched the footage on her laptop. The first clip she found was just a 30-second TikTok. Then she found another, and another. Before long she realized the entire world had pulled the curtain back on Westridge, and all fingers pointed to the same source. The anonymous caller. The racism, though never stated, was clear in every edit, every tweet, every burning comment section. She sat frozen, her mouth open, her chest tight. She had never meant for this, or so she told herself. But the fact remained, she had lit the match, and the world was now watching the fire. Commenters began digging deeper. An anonymous screenshot surfaced from a local HOA Facebook group. A post from Carolyn 6 months ago, complaining about unregulated events in the neighborhood. The comment section had grown ugly. The context now reeked of coded language. Someone leaked her name. Then her photo. Then her employer. Within hours, protesters began to gather in front of her house. Signs in hand. White fear, neon emergency. Karenism has consequences. You called the feds for flowers? But the real explosion hadn't even hit yet. Because just before midnight, the FBI released a short statement announcing an official press conference the following morning. The press release was vague, but the tension across the country was not. Everyone waited. For answers. For accountability. For some semblance of explanation. Some hoped the FBI would apologize. Clarify. De-escalate. But when the morning came and the director of communications, Dorian Vance, stepped up to the podium in his pressed navy suit, flanked by silent agents, he did the opposite. He looked into the camera, cleared his throat and said, Yesterday's incident in Westridge was unfortunate, but based on the information available at the time, the operation was lawful, by protocol, and appropriate under the Homeland Security threat matrix. Not a word of apology. Not a whisper of regret. No mention of Jonas Mercer. No acknowledgement that their agents had just violated the rights of one of the most powerful elected officials in the country. Twitter combusted. CNN cut live to a legal expert who could barely speak through her fury. Hashtags like, they knew he was black, FBI whitewash, and Stand with Jonas replaced every trending topic from sports to entertainment. But it was what happened 20 minutes later that changed everything. Because while the FBI was busy doubling down, Jonas finally decided to speak, and the world, still holding its breath, turned its eyes once more to a man who had been silent for far too long. The FBI holds a press conference and doubles down. The raid that had unfolded beneath blue skies and white chairs was no longer an isolated incident. It was a seismic crack in a carefully preserved facade, and the world was prying it open. The raid team, once anonymous silhouettes behind dark shades and heavier vests, now found themselves dragged into the spotlight. Faces once hidden by body armor were suddenly plastered across news broadcasts and viral tweets, and among those exposed was the operation's lead, Special Agent Kyle Drenner. Drenner, 47, had spent 2 decades inside the FBI's layered bureaucracy, climbing the ranks with quiet ambition and a reputation for aggressive enforcement. But beneath his commendations was a less flattering history, a pattern of conduct that had long tiptoed along the edge of ethical violations. 9 years earlier, Drenner had been passed over for a senior counterterrorism role. The reason, buried in internal memos, came down to a formal complaint from a Muslim civil liberties group. They alleged Drenner had used profiling practices that targeted religious communities during mosque surveillance assignments, though the complaint never led to disciplinary action, thanks to a lack of hard proof. It followed him like smoke trailing a fire that was never fully extinguished. He never forgot that demotion, and he never forgave the system, or the people he believed had tainted his record. Colleagues knew him as sharp, methodical, and unflinchingly loyal to protocol. But beneath that discipline was a quiet rigidity, a man who viewed nuance as threat, and who measured safety by proximity to whiteness. West Ridge, in his mind, was a clean zip code, a safe zone. The moment unfamiliar faces showed up in bulk, something primal in him clicked. He didn't need hard intel. Assumptions filled the blanks. But Drenner didn't act alone. The raid team consisted of 12 agents, each with their own histories, some clean, some stained, and within that group stood Agent Malik Grant, 28, the only black man on the squad. Malik had joined the bureau straight out of the University of Georgia, starry-eyed and eager to prove himself. He believed in justice, in law, in change from within. But on the day of the raid, standing in the back of the SUV, rifle slung tight to his chest, something in his gut twisted. He had recognized Jonas Mercer the moment the file dropped. He had recognized the address too. He'd seen the governor speak in D.C. 3 months ago, shaking hands with young activists. Malik admired him. He wanted to be him. But when he'd hesitated in the van, "Wait, this is the governor's house, right? You sure this isn't a wedding?" Drenner shot him a look that silenced the room. "Follow the op plan, Grant. Don't bring emotions to intel." Malik followed orders. Now he couldn't sleep. And the internet wasn't making it easier. Footage began surfacing that hadn't aired on CNN. Raw videos captured from angles the FBI didn't expect. One clip, uploaded anonymously, showed an elderly woman being yelled at as she clutched a Bible in her lap. Another revealed an agent kicking over a dessert table, flower petals and cake flying like debris in a storm. A third, more damning, showed an agent forcibly unzipping wrapped wedding gifts, pulling apart tissue paper and boxes like he was searching for explosives. A child could be heard crying in the background. The agents' faces were clear. People recognized them. One guest, a former prosecutor, began tagging their names in the footage, calling for accountability. Advocacy groups amplified her posts. Soon, demands were everywhere. "Release the raid footage. Fire Drenner. Why did they treat a wedding like a crime scene? Who gave the green light?" The FBI remained quiet. But inside the bureau, pressure was mounting. Agents whispered in break rooms. Senior staff scrambled for narrative control. Someone had even filed an anonymous internal complaint citing racially influenced operation approval. It wasn't hard to guess who. Malik sat in his apartment staring at the screen. The video looped over and over. Jonas Mercer, in cuffs, Amira on her knees, guest shouting for mercy, and in the corner his own blurred reflection in the SUV window. Still, silent. His phone rang. It was his sister. "Malik, I just saw the footage. You were there?" He didn't answer right away. "I was," he whispered.
"Why didn't you stop it?"
"I didn't know how." "Then maybe you shouldn't be wearing that badge." Her words weren't said in anger. They were said in disappointment. That was worse. Elsewhere in West Ridge, Jonas was no longer hiding. In fact, he was planning. The FBI's press conference, their cold clinical dismissal had pushed him past the threshold. His pain had transformed. No longer raw grief. No longer shame. Now it was resolve. He called a press meeting of his own. But it wasn't just for cameras. It was to announce legal action. Standing at a podium on the steps of Maryland's Supreme Court building, flanked by Amira, his legal counsel, and community leaders, Jonas looked directly into the lenses of the world. I stand before you today, not just as a man humiliated, but as a citizen violated. The federal agents who stormed my home, restrained me, and terrorized my family acted under the cover of protocol, but what they executed was racism, wrapped in process, shielded by silence. The crowd stirred. He continued. I have filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and specific agents involved in the operation. This isn't just about my wedding, this is about the systemic belief that black presence equals threat. He paused, and we will be requesting the full call log that triggered this raid. Every second, every word, every assumption. That sentence landed like thunder. Suddenly, the room understood. Jonas wasn't just seeking justice. He was hunting truth. He wasn't just coming for the agents. He was coming for whoever called them. Behind closed doors, Carolyn watched the press conference unfold on her television. Her fingers trembled over her teacup. The call log. She hadn't used her name when she called. But her voice was clear. And if they released the audio, if that audio became public, then the world wouldn't just know what she did. They'd know what she believed. The recordings she thought were private might just expose everything. Her fears, her assumptions, her words twisted into legal evidence. Jonas hadn't said her name. Not yet. But he didn't have to. The subpoena was coming. And Carolyn knew they wouldn't need facial recognition to find her. Her voice would be enough. Jonas files a federal civil rights lawsuit and subpoenas the call log. Carolyn Whitmore hadn't left her house in 2 days. Not since the press conference. Not since Jonas Mercer stood at that podium, voice unwavering, and declared he was subpoenaing the full call log that triggered the raid. She told herself she had nothing to fear. After all, she hadn't lied. Not technically. She simply reported what she saw, or rather, what she thought she saw. Large gathering, loud music, men in suits, SUVs. Was that not suspicious in a neighborhood like West Ridge? Was it so wrong to be cautious? But the rationalizations began to crumble the moment the voicemail was released. Jonas's legal team had moved fast. In under 48 hours, a federal judge ordered Homeland Security to turn over the 911 and FBI tip line recordings that had initiated the raid. They complied, reluctantly, and the files quickly leaked. Media outlets scrambled to publish the audio. The public devoured it. The clip opened with Carolyn's voice, clear, measured, and disturbingly calm. Yes. Hello. I'd like to report a potential domestic threat in my neighborhood. There's an unusual gathering next door. Dozens of people, maybe more. Loud, aggressive shouting. I believe there may be weapons involved. Military-style uniforms and black vehicles. They're behaving erratically, possibly foreign. There it was, a perfect cocktail of fear, precision, and coded racism. She never used words like black or wedding, but her tone carried centuries of bias. She painted an entire celebration as dangerous, with just a few careful phrases, and it worked. News anchors dissected her cadence like forensic evidence. She uses the term military-style uniforms, likely referring to tuxedos, said one legal analyst on MSNBC. She mentions foreign-sounding chants, which we now know were Nigerian wedding songs. The backlash was swift, ferocious, and relentless. Online sleuths dug deeper. They found Carolyn's past. It started with neighborhood complaints, small notes posted on West Ridge's HOA portal. She'd reported a black teenager for loitering with headphones. She called animal control on a Hispanic family's birthday party for excessive noise. She'd even once accused a Nigerian couple of potentially selling narcotics because of the unusual smell from their backyard barbecue. None of the reports ever led to action, but there were 9 of them, all filed within a 2-year span, all targeting black or brown neighbors. And then came the red thread. An anonymous tipster on Twitter connected Carolyn's email address to an old user profile on an alt-right internet forum. The account under the alias Patriot Maiden 62 had posted dozens of times over a 4-year span. The language was unmistakable. Neighborhoods don't feel safe anymore with all the diversity being pushed in. Why are we supposed to accept loud celebrations that don't match our values. Call before it's too late. Don't let them turn your suburb into a ghetto. Screenshots circulated with speed and fury. Carolyn's profile photo, an old family portrait with her golden retriever, was overlaid with text. This woman called the FBI on a black wedding. Within hours, a change.org petition demanding her termination from her job reached 150,000 signatures. Her employer, a private wealth management firm in Annapolis, released a vague statement. We are aware of recent reports regarding one of our employees. We are conducting an internal review. It wasn't enough. Protesters showed up outside the firm's lobby holding signs that read, "Racism is not a miscommunication. Fire her, or we move our money. You can't manage wealth with a bankrupt conscience." Inside her home, Carolyn spiraled. She hadn't answered her phone in days. Friends had stopped calling. The neighbors she once greeted with forced smiles now avoided her entirely. Even the mailman looked at her with pity. Her kitchen counters were cluttered with newspapers she didn't want to read. Headlines screamed from every surface. Wedding raid caller identified as suburban neighborhood watchdog. Racial profiling in West Ridge. When vigilance becomes violence. Carolyn Whitmore and the cost of cowardice. She called her sister in upstate New York. The phone rang twice, then voicemail. She texted her friend Linda. "Please talk to me. You know I didn't mean harm." No response. Even her dog, Jasper, seemed distant, slinking away from her lap when she tried to pet him. The silence in her home was suffocating. And then, the final blow came. A knock at her door. Sharp. Decisive. She peeked through the peephole and saw a man in a gray suit holding a folder. He didn't look like a protester. She opened it cautiously.
Miss Whitmore?
"Yes. I'm here on behalf of Greystone Wealth Partners. I've been sent to collect your company property." Excuse me? "You've been terminated. Effective immediately." She froze. You can't. There must be some mistake." The man didn't flinch. "The firm received overwhelming public pressure. Your role was tied to community outreach. They feel you can no longer represent the values of the organization." Carolyn gripped the edge of the door for support. Her world, once predictable, pristine and powerful, was now in freefall. And deep down she knew it wasn't the media that undid her. It was her own voice. The call she thought would disappear into the bureaucratic void had become the wrecking ball that shattered her quiet life. The problem wasn't misunderstanding. It was that, for the first time, the world had listened exactly to what she said and believed her. And now the woman who once lived her life, insulated from the consequences of her biases, was finally living in their debris. But the story wasn't done unraveling. Because what Carolyn didn't know, what no one outside Jonas's legal team knew, was that the call recording wasn't the only thing being subpoenaed. The FBI's internal threat tracking system logged not just audio but metadata, including geolocation, timestamps, and possible prior communications. And one of those logs revealed something unexpected. A private call from Carolyn's landline to a known DHS analyst, made 2 days before the wedding. Her employer receives public pressure and terminates her. The morning sun rose gently over West Ridge, as if the sky had not witnessed what unfolded beneath it days earlier. But for Jonas Mercer, there was no returning to quiet mornings. The raid, the footage, the humiliation, it had cracked something inside him open, and from that fracture emerged not brokenness but fire. He stood now, where it all happened. The gazebo, still stained with shattered glass and trampled petals, had been left untouched intentionally. No decorators, no crews to polish the damage. This was not a moment for erasure. This was a moment for confrontation. A podium had been set just outside the archway, flanked by state flags and rows of media trucks. Reporters swarmed like bees on a bloom. Mics raised, cameras pointed, anticipation humming in the late August air. Jonas adjusted his tie. It wasn't a new one. It was the same silk blue tie he wore during his first election night. The same one his mother had given him the day he graduated law school, saying, "Blue holds truth, son. Wear it when you need to say what matters." He looked out over the crowd. To the left stood his cabinet members. To the right, friends and neighbors. In front, America watching through live streams, on cable news, on phones held in trembling hands. But behind Jonas, just behind the makeshift stage, stood Amira. Not in a wedding gown, but in a sharp navy blazer, her curls pulled into a high bun, her expression unreadable. She hadn't left his side since the raid, but she hadn't said much either. The emotional wreckage had reshaped her, And now, like Jonas, she stood not as a victim but a witness. The cameras turned on. Jonas stepped to the mic. His voice was calm, but it carried a steel edge. 3 days ago, I stood right here. Not as a politician, not as your governor, just as a man, in love, ready to begin a life, surrounded by family, neighbors, friends. He paused. And then in seconds, I became something else. A code, a potential threat, a suspect. And for what? For celebrating while black? For existing without explanation. He let the silence hold. I was humiliated. My wife was terrorized. My guests, my elders, my children, all of them forced to witness a state-sponsored spectacle, fueled not by facts but by fear. The reporters scribbled feverishly. Some shook their heads. A few nodded. But what happened here, Jonas continued, will not live in silence. It will not end with apologies and edited statements. Because I will not let it. He lifted a folder. Today I'm introducing the Liberty and Accountability in Policing Act, LAPA, which will change how racial profiling is tracked, how community tips are vetted, and how agencies respond to unverified calls in non-emergency situations. The crowd stirred. This bill will require federal and local law enforcement to cross-reference threat reports, with confirmed intelligence, and establish a civilian oversight mechanism for all raids conducted in residential zones. It will also mandate racial bias training for all agents. And most importantly, criminalize false emergency reports made on the basis of race. He stepped back from the podium. Let it sink in. Because this, he said, gesturing to the ruined gazebo, was not just an error. It was a reflection of a system that still sees color before character, power before personhood. The silence was shattered by applause, then rising, then thunderous. The narrative had shifted. What had begun as a story of humiliation had been reclaimed, transformed into a political resurrection. Cable news anchors pivoted in real time. On CNN, Chandra Whitman declared, "We are witnessing not just the restoration of a man's dignity, but the ignition of a national movement." On MSNBC, a chyron read, "Governor Mercer proposes historic legislation after wedding raid." Even skeptics softened. A conservative columnist tweeted, "While I disagree with some of the bill's language, Mercer's poise and vision today were undeniably presidential. But the real shift came from within the people. Those who had once admired Jonas in passing, now fighting for him." Marches began forming under banners reading, "Stand with Jonas." Universities held teach-ins. Faith leaders led candlelight vigils outside courthouses. Back at the house, as the press dispersed and the gazebo slowly emptied, Jonas sat alone on the steps where he and Amira were supposed to exchange vows. His tie loosened, his eyes distant. Amira joined him silently, lowering herself beside him. "Are we still getting married?" she asked softly. He looked at her, smiled faintly. "We already are. Every day we survive this together. We're writing vows no one can interrupt." She rested her head against his shoulder. Then, just as the moment found peace, a man in a gray windbreaker approached. He wore no press badge, no mic, just a small black envelope in hand. Jonas looked up, wary.
Governor Mercer?
Yes?
The man glanced around, then crouched beside him. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm not with the press. I used to work with DHS. I was on the internal review team that scanned call logs after the raid." Jonas's posture stiffened. "There's something you need to see," the man said, slipping the envelope into his hand. "The FBI, they knew who you were before they stepped on your lawn." Jonas's heart stopped. "What?" "They identified your residence 40 minutes before the raid. Facial ID scans matched your profile. They ran it through facial recognition and state residency. They knew." The man stood quickly. "I shouldn't even be here. But they're going to try to bury it." He vanished into the crowd before Jonas could ask anything more. Jonas opened the envelope. Inside, a printout, low resolution but damning. An internal DHS dispatch, time-stamped 38 minutes before the raid, marked confidential. Subject ID'd, Jonas Mercer, Governor of Maryland. Proceed per threat protocol. He stared at the paper, his fingers tightening. They hadn't raided a house based on suspicion. They had raided a governor's wedding knowing full well who he was, and they'd done it anyway. Not by accident, but by intent. And if that was true, then everything was about to change. A whistleblower offers Jonas damning intel. The FBI knew he was the governor before the raid. The day after Jonas Mercer stood beneath his ruined gazebo, and lit a national flame with the Liberty and Accountability in Policing Act. The calls began to change. They were still coming in. His phone still buzzed every 20 seconds. But this time, the tone was different. Where once there had been solidarity, now there was strategic distance. A subtle shift in language. We're monitoring the situation. Let's wait and see what the committee says. There's a lot of heat right now. Timing might not be right. Even people he'd mentored, colleagues who'd once cried with pride on his campaign trail, were suddenly hard to reach. His chief of staff, Valeria, had a name for it. The DC slow fade, she muttered, tossing another carefully worded email into the trash. They want your strength when it's inspirational, but not when it's inconvenient. Jonas sat behind his office desk in Annapolis, a man now dangerous for the truth he exposed. His suit was crisp, his mind sharper than ever, but the room around him felt different. Isolated. Amira watched it unfold with a quiet fire building in her chest. So that's it? They cheer while you rise, but choke when you speak. Jonas didn't answer. He didn't have to. That same morning, a document leaked to the press. A 3-page internal Department of Homeland Security memo, obtained by a whistleblower. The contents were stunning. The memo, dated 1 hour before the raid, confirmed that Jonas's identity had been flagged and confirmed via biometric surveillance tools and state residency records. Subject match, 96.4%. Governor Jonas Mercer. Proceed under Standard Tier 2 protocol, given public profile. What stood out wasn't just that they knew who he was. It was the decision to proceed anyway. Under DHS protocol, any Tier 2 figure, especially elected officials, required director-level clearance for forced entry or tactical presence. That clearance never came. A line was crossed, and someone had decided to keep walking. Within hours, Homeland Security scrambled to respond. At a hastily arranged press briefing, DHS Director Howard Elbridge stood behind the podium, avoiding direct eye contact with the cameras. While we deeply regret the distress caused to Governor Mercer and his family, the operation conducted was within the scope of established procedures. We continue to investigate the origin of the call that prompted the deployment. The phrase regret, not wrongdoing, echoed like an insult. Jonas watched the broadcast from his office. Amira sat next to him, arms crossed, silent, regrettable but lawful. She finally whispered. That's what they're going with. Jonas leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching his reflection in the blackened screen. They knew, he said. They knew exactly who I was. And they chose the raid over the truth. His bill, LAPIA, was now more than policy. It had become a test, and Washington wasn't passing it. When the legislation was formally introduced to the Maryland state legislature, it received immediate support from progressive members, but then came the committee delays, language review, fiscal impact studies, jurisdiction concerns, excuses wrapped in bureaucracy. And behind closed doors, Jonas heard whispers. He's getting too aggressive. This might cost us next cycle. Maybe the governor's emotions are clouding his judgment. It was an old tune with a modern beat. Black man speaks truth. And suddenly he's labeled too loud, too angry, too dangerous. In a private meeting with Senator Louis Framley, a man who'd endorsed Jonas early in his campaign, Jonas laid out his frustration. We can't legislate around feelings, Louis. We legislate around facts. And the fact is that I was raided at my own wedding, because of my skin and my status. Framley raised a hand. Jonas, I believe you. I do. But you're pushing this too fast. You're making people nervous. Jonas leaned forward. Maybe they should be nervous. That night, back at home, Amira scrolled through emails from her hospital board. Her contract was under review, they said. Not for performance, not for any violation, just that her public alignment with recent activism might be distracting. She didn't even finish reading. Instead, she walked outside, past the front porch, and stood near the lawn where photographers still occasionally camped. The grass hadn't grown back fully from where the tactical boots had trampled it. She kicked off her heels and let the earth remind her that truth wasn't soft. It was jagged, unyielding. Jonas joined her moments later, holding 2 mugs of mint tea. We're losing friends, she said without looking at him. Then maybe they weren't friends. She nodded. You gonna give them a reason to remember your name again? He smiled faintly. More than that, I'm going to make it impossible to forget. But just as they began to reclaim the silence, Jonas's personal phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. Governor Mercer? Yes. My name's Rashad Jensen. I run private security for one of the HOA developments near you. I'm sending something to your encrypted line. I think you'll want to see it. What is it? Surveillance footage. Dated 2 days before your wedding. Jonas's pulse quickened. Of what? A woman older, white, tan jacket. She meets with a man in a federal vehicle, near the back entrance of your block. No official markings. No record of the visit. I ran facial ID. Jonas gripped the phone tighter. Who is she?
There was a pause.
Then, her name is Carolyn Whitmore. She's the woman who made the call, right? Jonas's blood ran cold. Jensen continued. Footage shows her speaking to what looks like a DHS agent. They exchange something, envelope, maybe documents. Then they shake hands and go separate ways. The video arrived 30 seconds later. Jonas clicked play. Carolyn, clear as day. Her face pinched with conviction. Speaking to a man with tactical boots and a DHS insignia half visible beneath his windbreaker. So this wasn't a call made in panic. This was planned, premeditated, coordinated. He looked at Amira. She hadn't seen the screen yet. We need to call Valeria, he said. Why? Jonas turned the screen toward her. Because Carolyn didn't just call the FBI. She met with them. And if that's true, this isn't about bias anymore. She stared at the video, her face unreadable. It's a setup. Jonas nodded slowly. And someone higher up approved it. A private security video surfaces, showing Carolyn speaking with an agent days before the wedding. For most of her life, Dr. Amira Caldwell had only ever been known for 3 things: her calm under pressure, her unshakable sense of purpose, and her healing hands. At 35, she had delivered over 400 babies, led trauma teams through hospital lockdowns, and earned respect in every surgical wing she'd stepped into. Patients called her a miracle worker. Nurses called her the calm in the storm. Her record was spotless, her composure legendary. Until now. Until the day she stood in her wedding gown, with tears staining her neckline, and her groom, the governor of Maryland, cuffed like a criminal, while she screamed into the void. That storm hadn't passed. It had followed her home, curled into her bed, and slept beside her. The first letter came 2 days after Jonas's press conference. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside, you're everything wrong with this country. Marrying a thug doesn't make you a queen. She didn't tell Jonas. She folded the note quietly and slid it into a drawer. But then came another, and another. Emails, voicemails. One even slipped into her hospital mailbox. A screenshot of her wedding photo, with a noose superimposed over Jonas's neck. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She'd dedicated her life to bringing black children safely into the world, and now that same world was sending her death threats for the man she loved. The trauma seeped in slowly, quietly. She began to flinch every time a helicopter passed overhead. She couldn't walk through the hospital lobby without wondering if someone was following her. One night, while prepping for surgery, she dropped a scalpel when a tray clattered behind her. She hadn't cried, not yet, but the tears lived just behind her eyes, waiting for permission. Then came the hospital board meeting. It was supposed to be routine. An executive check-in scheduled before the raid, but moved up without warning. She entered the glass-walled conference room and immediately sensed the shift. 5 board members sat stiffly, eyes scanning papers they didn't need to read. Dr. Caldwell, the chair began, her voice artificially warm. We're all very sorry for what happened to you and Governor Mercer, truly. But given the ongoing media attention and recent security concerns, Amira didn't move. Her posture didn't change. We believe it would be best for the hospital and for you if you took an extended leave of absence. The words landed like a punch. Security concerns? Amira asked, her voice a scalpel of its own. Well, patients are uneasy. Another board member chimed in. Some have requested transfers. We've even had a few donors call. Amira blinked slowly. You mean white donors? No one answered. You mean the ones who've never even been on my floor, but suddenly feel threatened by my existence. Doctor, the chair said gently. This isn't personal. It's procedural. Amira stood up. Funny, it feels very personal from where I'm sitting. She walked out before they could finish their sentence. Her resignation was quiet, but seismic. That night, she sat in her closet, knees drawn to her chest, wedding gown still hanging beside her. She hadn't taken it to the cleaners. She couldn't. She stared at it like a crime scene. The panic attacks came that week. Not loud, not violent, but paralyzing. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, but unable to scream. Jonas tried to hold her, tried to anchor her, but trauma is lonely, even when shared. She began journaling, trying to claw her way back to herself. And in those quiet hours, she started writing about Georgia. Her first memory of racism wasn't from adulthood. It was from the second grade. A field trip to a local plantation museum. The guide, a white woman in a corset, asked her if she'd like to pretend to pick cotton like the kids in the old days. Amira remembered the silence of her teacher, the smirk of a classmate, the heat rising in her cheeks as she looked at the bag of fake cotton and understood, somehow even at 8, that this wasn't a game for her. She'd buried it, like so many other things. The neighborhood kids who'd called her ashy. The math teacher who said she didn't look like a surgeon. The med school professor who told her she had the right kind of black. Now it all came rushing back, uninvited. As if the wedding had ripped open a portal to every moment she'd had to swallow her rage to survive. But rage doesn't stay swallowed forever. It rises. It demands air. One morning, Amira sat in her kitchen scrolling through local news when she saw the headline, West Ridge to host emergency town hall meeting. After FBI raid fallout, the HOA had invited local officials, law enforcement reps. A civil conversation, they called it. Jonas planned to attend, but this time, so would Amira. Not as a wife, not as a doctor, but as a black woman who had been targeted, silenced and told to smile through it. She told Jonas that evening over dinner. "I'm speaking," she said simply. He looked up. "You sure?" "I've been sure since they told me to take a leave. Since they sent that noose in an email. Since I watched you be treated like a felon on the day we were supposed to become one." Jonas reached across the table and took her hand. "Then I'll be in the front row." Amira nodded, the first true calm returning to her chest in days. Later that night, as she prepared her notes, a delivery arrived at their front door. No name, no return address. She opened the box. Inside a small USB drive and a single note card. The note read, "This wasn't about fear. It was about silencing you both." She stared at the USB, her heart suddenly racing. Jonas walked in moments later and saw her frozen at the table.
What is it?
She handed him the drive. "There's more," she said. "Someone wants us to see it." And in that instant, she knew. The town hall wouldn't be the end of her voice. It would be the beginning. She decides to hold a town hall to speak, unapologetically, as a black woman under siege. The folding chairs were arranged in rows inside the West Ridge Community Center, but they couldn't contain the weight of what the evening had come to represent. Residents filled the seats like jurors summoned to witness the trial of their own community, each one clutching in expectation, closure, justification, or maybe just clarity. Outside, protesters gathered with candles and signs, their presence forcing the HOA board to increase security. But inside, there were no uniforms, no agents, just neighbors, and the quiet hum of tension that blanketed the room like a wool coat in July. At the center of it all was a single wooden podium, with a microphone. And behind it stood Dr. Amira Caldwell, no longer just a name on local news tickers, no longer a whisper behind glass doors. Tonight she was the voice of reckoning.
The room dimmed, and HOA President Elaine Voss, face strained with the weight of a public relations nightmare, cleared her throat.
"Thank you all for being here. The purpose of this town hall is to listen, to understand, and to move forward as a united community." Her voice cracked on united. "We've heard from law enforcement. We've heard from officials. But tonight we begin by hearing from the woman who was most affected by the incident that occurred just 3 weeks ago." Amira stepped up, clutching a tablet in her hand and a notepad beneath it. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a black blouse and slacks, elegant, defiant in their simplicity. For a moment she said nothing. Then she lifted her gaze. "I grew up believing silence was the only way to survive in neighborhoods like this," she began, voice calm but deliberate. "You keep your head down, you wave politely, you do everything right, and maybe, just maybe, they'll let you belong." A murmur rippled across the room. "I'm a physician. I've delivered hundreds of babies in this state. I've held mothers' hands during miscarriages, and sat with fathers through emergency surgeries. And yet, 3 weeks ago, in my own backyard, I was treated like a trespasser." She paused. "My wedding day was supposed to be sacred. Instead, it was stormed." She looked around, locking eyes with neighbors she had once greeted in passing. "Not one of you knocked on our door to check on us. Not one of you brought food, sent a message, or asked if we were okay, and you live right next to me." A long silence followed. "I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here for accountability. Because silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity. And Westridge has been silent long before my wedding." A woman in the second row sobbed quietly. Amira opened her tablet and tapped a few times. Behind her, the projector flickered to life. Footage appeared, muted clips from the wedding, from different angles. Groomsmen standing still with hands raised. Amira's grandmother trembling. Officers rifling through wrapped wedding gifts. Guests ushering children behind tables. And then Amira pressed another button. A freeze frame appeared. Carolyn Whitmore, clearly visible standing with a DHS agent, 2 days before the wedding. Gasps scattered across the room like gunshots. "That's your neighbor," Amira said quietly. "That's the woman who said it was all a misunderstanding." A few heads turned toward the back row, where Richard Whitmore, Carolyn's husband, sat stiffly in a beige sweater. His face was pale, but his jaw clenched. He stood. "My wife isn't a racist," he said loudly. "She was scared. She did what anyone would do. Over-policing is better than under, especially in this climate. You all know that." The room turned tense. Amira tilted her head. Would she have made that call if it was a white couple getting married in a backyard with jazz music and champagne? She asked. She saw what she saw. "No," she assumed. What she assumed. "And your defense of that assumption is what keeps this neighborhood sick." Richard took a breath, eyes scanning for support, but the room had turned. Elaine Voss stepped forward again, clearly rattled. Let's please remain respectful." Amira looked at her. "I am being respectful, but I won't be polite about injustice anymore. That's the trap. That's what keeps these conversations surface level." The woman who sobbed earlier stood slowly. "I live across from you, Dr. Caldwell," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "And you're right. I didn't check on you. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, but I said nothing, and that was worse." Amira nodded. "Thank you." Another neighbor raised their hand. "I didn't even know Jonas was the governor. I just thought you two were too good for us." Amira let the comment land. "And what made you think that?" They said nothing. She turned back to the audience. "You don't have to like me, but you have to look in the mirror. Because this wasn't just about one woman's fear. It was about a system you've all benefited from staying silent inside." The room sat breathless. Jonas, seated in the front row, had not moved. His eyes never left Amira. The projector faded to black. Amira closed her tablet. "I'm not leaving West Ridge. I won't be bullied out of my home, my marriage, or my name. We are not temporary guests here. We're part of this community, and it's time you treated us that way." The applause began slowly, then grew into something thunderous. The board was stunned. Their plan to smooth tensions had been eclipsed by something bigger. Truth with a spine. A few moments later, Elaine took the podium again, her face pale but composed. "There's one more item on tonight's agenda," she said. She held up a motion card. "A proposal has been introduced to rename West Ridge Community Park, after someone who raised one of the most honorable public servants this state has seen. A woman who endured housing discrimination, public harassment, and raised her son with dignity anyway." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Elaine continued. "We propose renaming the park to Evelyn Mercer Memorial Park." The silence that followed wasn't from resistance. It was reverence. A vote was held. The result, unanimous. Amira's lips parted. Stunned. She hadn't expected this. Jonas reached for her hand. But even as the room filled with a sense of long overdue justice, Amira's phone buzzed. One notification. Just one. But it shifted everything. She opened the encrypted message sent to her inbox. Subject line: confidential, internal memo leak. The body of the email contained a single sentence. "The DHS contact your neighbor spoke to. He was flagged 2 years ago for unauthorized surveillance of minority officials in New York." Amira inhaled sharply. There was more to uncover. The wedding raid wasn't just racial bias. It was a test run. The town votes to rename their community park after Jonas's mother. Justice had never been a sprint. Jonas Mercer knew that. He'd spent years watching legislation die in committee, watching good men fall to procedural delay and bureaucratic noise. But this wasn't just slow. This was resisted at every turn. The lawsuit, officially titled Mercer v. United States Department of Homeland Security et al., was filed in federal court 3 weeks after the town hall. By then, public pressure had reached its peak. with nightly pundits debating whether Jonas's legal action was a moral stand or a political stunt. Jonas didn't flinch. He knew the stakes. The complaint alleged violation of civil rights, abuse of federal authority, racial targeting, and willful negligence, all stemming from the FBI raid of his private wedding. And it named names. Special Agent Kyle Drenner, Homeland Security Director Howard Elbridge, anonymous DHS operative X, the one seen speaking with Carolyn in the security footage. And yes, Carolyn Whitmore herself, listed as a catalyst and civilian collaborator. The court approved expedited depositions, citing national interest. That's when the squirming began. Inside a cold conference room in downtown D.C., attorneys gathered like sharks circling a bleeding system. The first to testify was Drenner, stiff suit, eyes sharp, jaw tight. He'd been advised by his legal team to stick to policy. And he did. We followed all protocols. The threat indicators were consistent with domestic terror watch list behavior. We had no knowledge of the subject's political identity until post-engagement. But the evidence said otherwise. Jonas's legal counsel, Camille Foster, a black woman who'd built her reputation suing 3 police departments in 5 years, didn't hold back. She pulled up the time-stamped biometric scan from DHS archives. Agent Drenner, this document shows the identity match of Governor Mercer 40 minutes prior to the raid. Can you explain why the operation was not aborted immediately? Drenner hesitated. Intel wasn't yet verified. Camille arched an eyebrow. Are you saying the FBI acted with unverified intel about a sitting governor? Or that you disregarded confirmed intel to proceed with an illegal raid? Drenner's silence spoke volumes. The room froze. But it was Malik Grant's deposition that detonated everything. He entered the courtroom wearing a simple black suit and a face etched with guilt. The youngest agent on the team. The only black one. He took a deep breath and began. I didn't know we were raiding the governor's home until we pulled up and I recognized him. I froze. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. Camille stepped forward. Why didn't you? Because the room didn't feel safe for me either. That line shattered the courtroom. He continued. During the operation, one agent, Agent Park, said, "These people sure know how to make everything look nice before it blows up." Another said, "I bet half of them got warrants." Camille leaned in. Did anyone reprimand them? No. Did you? No. Why not? He paused. Because I knew if I did, I'd become the threat. The judge asked for quiet. But the air had already thickened with a truth that could no longer be ignored. Next came Carolyn Whitmore. She was deposed in private chambers, her legal team insisting on the move for security and mental health concerns. When asked basic questions, did you make the call? Did you meet with the DHS agent before the wedding? Carolyn did not deny. She just said, I plead the fifth, over and over, even when shown the footage of her meeting the agent. Even when asked about the tip line call logs. Even when confronted with her alt-right forum posts. She pled the fifth until her voice was barely a whisper. And still, no apology, no acknowledgement, no accountability. That silence only fueled the fire. 2 weeks later, Judge Rebecca Morales, a Latina jurist known for her sharp legal mind and intolerance for bureaucratic double talk, issued a public preliminary ruling. The evidence presented demonstrates a gross abuse of discretion. The defendants acted on racial bias masked as security concern. This court rules that the operation was a federal overreach without probable cause, and that civil rights may have been violated. This case will proceed to trial. The media erupted. News tickers blared. Judge rules wedding raid unjustified. Mercer case headed to trial. FBI under fire for targeting black governor. Public support surged. Protesters returned to the streets, not just for Jonas and Amira, but for everyone who'd ever been pulled over, profiled, or targeted because of the color of their skin. Jonas and Camille met that evening in a small war room above her law office. She laid out the next steps. Discovery, witness prep, jury strategy. But before they could begin, Camille's assistant knocked on the door. Governor Mercer? A package just arrived. Confidential, no return address. Jonas opened it slowly. Inside, a plain envelope and a letter. Typed. You're winning too loudly. Some things are best handled quietly. Consider this a final opportunity. Attached was a settlement offer from the FBI. $10 million. With a non-disclosure agreement that would bar Jonas from speaking publicly about the raid ever again. The room went still. Camille stared at the figure. This is real money. Jonas looked at it like it was poison. They want me to shut up. They want this to go away. Jonas stood, jaw tightening. I didn't come this far to be bought. But even as he ripped the letter in half, something gnawed at him. Why now? Why offer a payout when the case was already rolling toward victory? Unless someone higher up was about to be exposed. Someone the public hadn't seen yet. And someone willing to pay any price to stay in the shadows. The FBI quietly offers Jonas a $10 million settlement, with a gag order. The check sat on Jonas Mercer's desk, like a loaded weapon. $10 million. That was the number the FBI believed could buy silence, extinguish momentum, and fold the story neatly into America's growing archive of unresolved injustice. But Jonas didn't even touch it. Instead, he stared at the letter that came with it. The crisp legal jargon, the confidentiality clause, the veiled threat disguised as opportunity. In the interest of national stability, it read to preserve reputational integrity of all parties. Camille Foster stood across from him, arms folded, her voice low but firm. If you sign this, you can't speak another word about the raid. No testimony, no book, no interviews, nothing. Jonas let out a breath, measured and deliberate. So they're not offering a settlement. They're offering silence. Camille nodded, wrapped in gold leaf. He picked up the letter, turned it over, and stared at the Department of Justice watermark. His face stayed calm, but his hand trembled barely. He thought of Amira, still recovering from PTSD episodes that now came without warning. He thought of the guests at their wedding, some still in therapy. He thought of his mother, long gone, who once told him, if a man offers you a ladder out of a burning house, but the house is burning because he set the fire, you take the water, not the ladder. He ripped the check in half. I'd rather be broke and honest than rich and muzzled. And with that, he took the podium the next morning, outside the same courthouse where the lawsuit had been filed, and shocked the country. I'm not taking the money, because justice is not for sale, and neither is my silence. The crowd roared, but he wasn't finished. This moment is bigger than me. It's bigger than a ruined wedding. It's about power and who's allowed to hold it without punishment. And I've spent my career fighting from the inside, quietly, respectfully. But now I realize, we don't just need to fight harder, we need to fight louder. He paused, then dropped the bomb. Which is why today, I'm announcing my candidacy for the United States Senate. The press lost control. Microphones surged forward. Questions flew like arrows. But Jonas stepped down from the podium before any could land. The announcement detonated across the media. Governor Mercer declines $10 million settlement. Announces Senate run. From wedding raid to Washington. A movement is born. Mercer leads Senate polls by 12 points following shocking presser. Cable networks couldn't get enough. Social media turned him into a living symbol. Overnight, Jonas wasn't just a gubernatorial success story. He was a national figurehead for accountability, racial justice, and institutional reform. Even celebrities weighed in. Kerry Washington tweeted, "This is what leadership looks like." Ava DuVernay shared a clip of the press conference with the caption, "He's not just speaking for himself, he's speaking for generations." Donations poured into his campaign. Grassroots dollars. $5 at a time, from people who had never met him but saw themselves in him. And with momentum came change. The Department of Justice launched a formal inquiry into the DHS operation. A bipartisan coalition in Maryland introduced a bill that mirrored LAPA, fast-tracked by the very lawmakers who once stalled his proposals. But not everyone was celebrating. In West Ridge, Carolyn Whitmore's house sat dark. Windows shuttered, mail piling up. Neighbors whispered she'd left in the middle of the night, taking her dog in just a single suitcase. No forwarding address, no social media activity. Her employer confirmed she never picked up her last paycheck. Rumors spread fast. She's hiding out in Idaho. She changed her name. The FBI relocated her for protection. She was never just a neighbor. She was part of something deeper. Jonas didn't care where she was. Not anymore. To him, Carolyn was never the true enemy. She was a symptom, a visible face of an invisible system. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. Late one evening, a delivery arrived at his campaign headquarters, addressed simply to the candidate. No return label, just a padded envelope. Jonas was in the middle of reviewing education policy notes when his assistant Marcus placed the package in front of him. "Another endorsement kit?" Marcus asked, half joking. Jonas opened it, slowly. Inside were 6 printed photographs. Glossy, full color. He shuffled through them. Each frame was sharper than the last. Carolyn Whitmore. walking through the halls of the FBI headquarters in D.C. Not once,
Not twice.
but 4 times on 4 different days prior to the raid. In one photo, she stood beside a man with a badge, laughing. In another, she handed over what appeared to be a thin dossier. Jonas's breath caught. The final photo, timestamped at 48 hours before the raid, showed Carolyn leaving the building with a DHS visitor badge still clipped to her collar. He turned the photos over, hoping for a note. There was none. Only one scrawled sentence, written on the envelope flap. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was their entry point. Jonas stared at the images, not out of shock, but out of clarity. The puzzle had never been about one rogue call. It had been a coordinated hit strategically disguised as a mistake. And now he had the proof. He picked up his phone and called Camille. "I need a forensic team," he said. "And I need a press conference ready by tomorrow." She didn't ask questions. Jonas stood, slowly, photos in hand, looking out at the glowing skyline beyond his office window. They had tried to silence him, tried to buy him, tried to break him. But what they'd really done was give him a platform, and now he was going to use it to drag the truth out, by the root. An anonymous package arrives at Jonas's campaign office, containing photos of Carolyn at FBI HQ. It started with a whisper. A rumor passed from inbox to inbox between investigative reporters hungry for the next lead. Jonas Mercer's wedding wasn't just a one-off tragedy. They were told. It was the tip of something far deeper. It wasn't just about Carolyn. It wasn't just about West Ridge. It was about a pattern. A team of journalists at the Washington Herald, led by award-winning reporter Nia Patel, decided to dig. Her team cross-referenced law enforcement activity logs, scanned public tip-line records, and examined federal response times to domestic threats across the state of Maryland. What they uncovered blew the story wide open. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable. Over the past 3 years, a quiet task force within the Department of Homeland Security, operating under the umbrella of Community Stability Surveillance Initiative, CSSI, had executed 14 raids across Maryland and Northern Virginia, each one targeting events in predominantly Black or immigrant communities. Barbecues, birthday parties, cultural festivals, church cookouts. The justifications were always the same: unusual gathering, foreign music, unconfirmed threat, anonymous tip. But none of these events had ever resulted in a single arrest. And none of the tipsters were ever identified. Until Jonas's wedding. That was their mistake, because the cameras were rolling. And this time their suspect wore a tailored suit and held public office. Jonas sat across from Nia in a quiet cafe in Georgetown when she presented the findings. "I've confirmed at least 5 DHS agents assigned to CSSI who were involved in similar operations," she said, laying out a stack of documents. "Why hasn't this come out before?" Jonas asked. "Because no one had the kind of footage your wedding gave us. Everything before this was explained away as overcaution or neighborhood concerns. The reports vanished into redacted memos. But your case pulled the curtain." He leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. "They were practicing," he murmured, "refining the model." Nia nodded. It wasn't about protecting neighborhoods. It was about testing how far they could go when the targets looked a certain way. That evening, the Washington Herald dropped the bombshell expo. Beyond the wedding, inside DHS's secret pattern of targeting Black communities, screenshots from declassified reports, names of agents involved in multiple raids, statistics showing an undeniable racial disparity in community threat responses, and the biggest revelation yet, a private memorandum of understanding between the DHS and the West Ridge Homeowners Association. It had been signed quietly, tucked into a housing redevelopment plan, and never disclosed publicly. In the agreement, West Ridge's HOA had consented to share surveillance camera access, visitor logs, and anonymous complaints directly with DHS, circumventing local law enforcement and due process protocols. Jonas stared at the document, stunned. "They created a surveillance state right under our feet," Amira said, holding the printed agreement, and nobody said a word. Valeria, his chief of staff, was already drafting a press release. "They did this to you, Jonas. But they've done it to hundreds. You were just the one who had a platform. The others, they disappeared." For the next 48 hours, news coverage swelled. Protests erupted in multiple cities. Civil rights organizations filed companion lawsuits. Lawmakers who once played cautious began scrambling to co-sponsor LAPA to save their reputations. But the final blow hadn't landed yet. Because while the Washington Herald was digging into DHS and the HOA, Jonas's legal team had been working behind the scenes, requesting a court order to unseal internal FBI communications related to CSSI. Most had been stonewalled. Until now. On a rainy Thursday morning, in a federal courthouse in Baltimore, Judge Rebecca Morales issued her ruling. The public interest and constitutional implications of this case override the confidentiality protections asserted by the defendants. The court hereby orders the unsealing of all internal communications tied to the CSSI task force and the raid on Governor Jonas Mercer's residence. Within hours, over 300 pages of internal emails were released. Jonas sat at his campaign headquarters, surrounded by Camille, Valeria, and his team, as they combed through them. The language was chilling. Ensure all ops in zip codes 200746, 20774, and 260, flagged as high-noise, high-foreign culture events are logged for rapid response. Priority attention to group gatherings, high-density African-American presence near gated communities. Tip sources should be weighted by demographic alignment. W target area. White informants in mixed zones is more reliable intel. If subjects hold public office, do not abort, proceed unless instructed otherwise. Visibility, not immunity. Camille stared at the screen, face pale. They documented their racism, like it was policy. Jonas couldn't speak. His breath came slow, like his body was trying to keep him from combusting. They had built this, not in secret, but in silence.
Not in basements,
but in inboxes. Jonas stood slowly and left the room. He walked out into the night, rain falling against his blazer, hands clenched in his pockets. Amira followed him moments later, umbrella in hand. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him, holding the umbrella above both their heads. After a long silence, Jonas finally whispered, "They did this to us knowing exactly who I was." Amira looked at him. "And you know what that means, right?" He nodded. "It means they're not scared of being caught. They're scared of us being loud." And now, they had no choice but to be louder than ever. But just as Jonas turned back toward the building, Valeria burst through the doors, her phone in hand. "Judge Morales just updated the ruling," she said breathlessly. "One more email was unsealed. Time-stamped 10 days before your wedding." She handed Jonas the phone. He read the email aloud. From K. Drenner, a DH, to H. Delbridge. Subject, West Ridge Coordination. "If this wedding goes down as planned, it'll make Mercer untouchable in the next cycle. Let's give them a dose of humility, before we all have to call him Senator." Jonas looked up. There it was. Intent. Documented. Strategic. Undeniable. The raid wasn't a failure of communication. It was an attempted takedown of a rising black leader by his own government. A judge unseals internal FBI emails, revealing racial profiling as a documented tactic. By the time fall arrived in D.C., the leaves outside the Capitol had turned the color of fire, burnt red, scorched orange, ash brown, a fitting reflection of what was happening inside the halls of power. Because America was burning, not from chaos, but from truth. The Mercer wedding raid, once dismissed as a tragic error, had become a national case study in state-sanctioned surveillance, racism, and the silent machinery that fueled it. The unsealed emails sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. Suddenly, no one could pretend it was just one agent, or one mistake, or one bad call. The system hadn't malfunctioned. It had operated exactly as it was built. Congressional hearings were scheduled within days of the final email release. Led by Representative Darnell Price, the first black chairman of the House Oversight Committee, the hearings were broadcast live, drawing millions of viewers across every state. Jonas sat quietly during the first day of testimony, not at the witness table, but in the audience, wearing a navy suit and the same tie he wore on inauguration night. Amira sat beside him. Camille and Valeria were a few rows back. The room buzzed with media, but inside it, Jonas was still, not because he wasn't furious. He was, but because he knew this was what justice should look like. Slow, painful, relentless. One by one, DHS and FBI officials were called to testify. Each time a name was read aloud, it echoed with public weight. Agent Kyle Drenner resigned the day after the email leak, but he was still compelled to testify under subpoena. His face on the stand was stone cold, but the cracks were visible. "Agent Drenner," Reprace asked, "were you aware Governor Mercer's identity had been confirmed prior to the raid?" Drenner stared forward. "Yes." "Then why did you proceed?" Pause. "Because we viewed his influence as an amplification risk." A gasp cut through the room. Raprice leaned forward. Let me repeat your words back to you. You proceeded with a raid on the home of a black elected official. On his wedding day because his influence made him dangerous? Drenner swallowed hard. No further questions. Several agents followed suit, offering half-hearted explanations. Some blamed training. Some blamed leadership. One agent broke down crying mid-testimony, confessing he hadn't realized the impact until his own daughter came home from school, asking, "Why do the cops hate people who look like daddy?" By week 2, 3 DHS officials and 2 FBI agents had resigned. 2 were placed on administrative leave, pending criminal investigation. The phrase institutional failure appeared in every headline. And still Carolyn Whitmore was nowhere to be found, subpoenaed for testimony, required by federal order. But when her name was called on the 3rd day of hearings, her seat remained empty. Her attorney released a brief statement. Ms. Whitmore has experienced undue harassment and emotional trauma as a result of public backlash. She is currently receiving care out of state and is unfit for testimony at this time. A convenient collapse. Yet even her absence was telling. Because while America debated whether or not Carolyn was a pawn or a participant, one fact remained unshakable. She was the one who unlocked the door, and she wasn't coming to explain herself. Jonas didn't need her to. Because by now the country had seen everything it needed to. The week after the hearings closed, the Maryland General Assembly voted on the Liberty Act, a refined version of the original LAPA legislation Jonas had introduced. The final version required mandatory race-neutral protocols for tip-line verifications, prohibition of anonymous community-based surveillance partnerships, civilian oversight of all raids conducted in suburban or residential communities, severe penalties for false emergency reports based on race, religion, or cultural identifiers. To everyone's surprise, the bill passed with bipartisan support. Even Republicans, once hesitant, now voted in favor, citing an opportunity to restore public trust. It was poetic. The same political system that once resisted Jonas's warnings had been forced to act when the receipts were dragged into daylight. In the press conference after the vote, Jonas stood behind a podium, tired but triumphant. The Liberty Act is not a conclusion. It's a correction. But the truth is, we should have never needed this law in the first place. Reporters asked about justice, about the trial, about Carolyn. But Jonas stayed focused. We can't legislate empathy, but we can make discrimination costly. He walked away without fanfare. He didn't need it. Because behind him, America was already rewriting what it expected from justice. But just as the legislative victory began to settle, just as the polling for his Senate campaign reached a 14-point lead and whispers of the next Barack started floating across editorial rooms, the air shifted again. 3 days before election night, Jonas arrived at his campaign office to find Camille and Valeria waiting, their faces unreadable. "What's wrong?" he asked. Valeria handed him a laptop. "No words," she said. "Just watch." Jonas pressed play. It was grainy, clearly shot from a cell phone, and silent at first. But then the sound kicked in, muffled, but unmistakable. The video showed Jonas standing in a hotel lobby. The date stamp, 1 month before the wedding. A young woman approached him. Blonde, dressed in a red jacket. She said something inaudible, laughed. Then Jonas leaned in. Too close. It looked harmless. But then she touched his hand. He didn't pull away fast enough. There was nothing overt. No kissing. No inappropriate contact. But the way the video had been edited, cut into jagged fragments, looped with ominous background music, it looked like something else. A scandal. A betrayal. A whisper campaign weaponized. "Where did this come from?" Jonas asked, voice low. Valeria stared at him. "It was sent anonymously, to 5 networks, 4 packs. And it's trending already. Mercer moment. Is all over X." Amira hadn't seen it yet. Jonas felt his throat tighten. Not from guilt, but from fury. Because he knew what this was. A final play. The system, cornered, was clawing back. "If they can't kill the policy, they'll try to kill the man," Camille said. He nodded. He didn't owe the world perfection. But the timing was no accident. He looked at Valeria. "Is the full video traceable?" "We're trying. But this clip was cut to maximize implication and minimize truth. It's a weapon." Jonas looked toward the window. The city lights shimmering in the glass like distant fires. He could already feel the headlines breathing down his back. And he knew the next 24 hours could decide everything. Election night approaches, and a mysterious video leaks. The sky above Capitol Hill had never looked more beautiful. It was as if the clouds had rehearsed, the sun had taken its cue, and the breeze arrived on time to whisper across the marble steps of a nation, still trying to reckon with itself. Where dignitaries usually walked and debates echoed in chambers, a white runner now stretched across the lawn. Rows of folding chairs flanked either side. Floral arches framed the Capitol dome in the background. A gospel choir warmed up near the rotunda, their harmonies lifting gently into the fall air like a quiet promise. It was not just a wedding. It was a reclamation. Jonas Mercer and Amira Caldwell were finally getting married again. But this time, nothing and no one could interrupt. Not sirens. Not suspicion.
Not systems.
This was the wedding that should have been, but was made more powerful by the fact that it came after everything that tried to stop it. The invitation list was intentionally democratic. Civil rights leaders, former marchers from the 60s, local teachers, nurses, organizers, survivors. Celebrities came not to be seen, but to witness. Elected officials from both sides of the aisle sat in the back, unphotographed, humbled. Amira stood in a soft ivory gown, no veil this time. She had nothing to hide. Her curls were free, her eyes strong. She wore no jewelry, beyond a single gold bracelet that belonged to Jonas's late mother, Evelyn. Jonas, standing beneath the arch, wore a navy suit, not because it was formal, but because it was the same color as the tie he wore when he first declared his run for office. A color of resolve, a nod to memory. As the choir quieted, the officiant stepped forward. A woman named Reverend Adina Brooks, who had once been arrested for integrating lunch counters in Greensboro, now stood with her voice steady, gaze proud. "We are gathered here today," she began, "not just to witness a union, but to celebrate a victory, not of politics, but of love, not of vengeance, but of truth." The crowd stood in reverent silence. Amira stepped forward, took Jonas's hands. They needed no script this time. The words were carved in their bones.
Jonas, she said, you didn't save me. You reminded me I didn't need saving. Through everything they did to break us, you remained whole, and I vow to build the rest of this life with you, boldly and out loud.
He took a breath. "Amira, you've carried me through nights where I had nothing left but breath. You've shown me that softness isn't weakness, that power can heal. I vow to spend the rest of my life standing with you, and when needed, standing behind you." The kiss was quiet, long, and soft, and when they turned to face the crowd, the applause rose like thunder, because the ceremony wasn't about what they were starting. It was about what they had survived. But the final surprise came just after the crowd began to move, as flashbulbs clicked, and reporters scrambled for quotes. A black SUV pulled quietly onto the side lawn. Out stepped two plainclothes U.S. Marshals. They walked with purpose, no rush, no performance, and made their way toward the back row, where a woman sat alone. Carolyn Whitmore. Her hair was shorter, dyed a shade too dark. Her clothes hung off her like she was trying to disappear. The crowd stilled. The moment was unmistakable. The lead marshal approached. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for knowingly filing a false federal report, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to incite a false law enforcement operation." Carolyn didn't resist. She stood. Her hands trembled, her mouth opened, but no words came. She was cuffed gently. Not violently, but publicly. Jonas watched from the front steps. For a moment his eyes locked with hers. She looked defeated, but not sorry. Amira reached for his hand. "Don't let her steal this moment." "I'm not," he said. "I'm letting it finish." The crowd didn't cheer.
They didn't boo.
They just watched the same way America had watched a wedding turn into a raid, and now a reckoning. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the dome, and the lawn began to clear, Jonas took the podium set up just beyond the floral arch. He wasn't dressed for politics, but the speech was political nonetheless. 324 days ago they came to my wedding, not with gifts or grace, but with guns and fear. He paused. They tried to take my joy. They tried to humiliate me. They tried to silence my wife. They came for my family, with the full weight of institutions we were taught to trust. He looked out at the crowd. But you all saw it, and more importantly, you shared it. You stood up. You shouted down every excuse, and you reminded this country that visibility is power. He stepped down one step. They came for my wedding. The crowd leaned forward. Now I'm coming for their law. Cheers erupted, not just with bills, but with ballots, with blackboards, with babies who grow up never questioning whether they belong. He smiled, a little softer now, and with love. Always. With love. That night, the image of Jonas and Amira dancing under string lights, swaying in front of the Capitol, became an instant American icon. Shared, reposted, memorialized. It wasn't just a love story, it was a testimony. But as they stepped away from the cameras and the crowd faded into quiet celebration, Jonas sat alone for a moment on the Capitol steps, holding Amira's heels in one hand and her phone in the other. He scrolled past the photos, past the headlines, and stopped on one thing: the original video. The one from the wedding. The one that had gone viral. He watched it again. The screams. The confusion. The moment Amira screamed his name. And then he asked himself something he hadn't dared until now. What if that video had never gone viral? What if there had been no footage? What if there had been no pressure? No protests? No hearings? No justice? Would they still be here? Would this day have ever happened? Would any of it matter?
The weight of that question sat heavy in his chest.
Because the truth hadn't saved them. Visibility had, and that meant millions of others, quiet, undocumented, invisible, were still waiting for someone to hit record. What if that video had never gone viral? ChatGPT said, some scars don't show up on skin, they show up in silence, in the moments we're told to sit down, shut up, and be grateful. But stories like this prove one thing: silence is no longer an option. If you believe the truth deserves